Hollywood had watched Marilyn Monroe walk into a room before. It had watched thousands of cameras turn toward her. It had watched men forget what they were saying. It had watched entire crowds erupt simply because she smiled. But on this night, Marilyn Monroe wasn't supposed to be the star. She wasn't supposed to sing. She wasn't even supposed to leave her seat. And yet, before the night was over, an entire room would stand for her. While the one man who had commanded that room all evening would step into the shadows and let Marilyn take everything from him. Her voice, her fear, her silence. And for a few unforgettable minutes, the woman Hollywood thought it knew would finally show them the woman they had never seen. But nobody knew that when the lights first came up. Marilyn was sitting quietly in the back of the room, watching, waiting, and completely unaware that Frank Sinatra was about to change the entire night with one simple gesture. The room was magnificent. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, throwing warm light across polished tables covered in white linen. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the lights. Waiters moved between Hollywood's most powerful guests, while photographers searched constantly for the next unforgettable image. Actors were there. Producers were there. Directors, journalists, businessmen. People who could make careers. People who could destroy them. And at the center of it all stood Frank Sinatra. The orchestra behind him was enormous. Strings, piano, brass, percussion. Every musician knew exactly when to breathe, and Sinatra knew exactly when to make them stop. He stood beneath the spotlight with the confidence of a man who had spent years learning how to control a room. Then he began to sing. His voice was low, smooth, almost dangerously calm. It didn't attack the audience. It pulled them toward him. One table after another became silent. A woman stopped talking. A man lowered his glass. A famous actor leaned forward. The photographers slowly lowered their cameras. Nobody wanted to interrupt Sinatra. For several minutes, the room belonged completely to him. And then, he stopped. No warning. No explanation. The orchestra stopped instantly. The final note disappeared. Silence swallowed the room. Hundreds of people stared at the stage. Sinatra stood completely still. He didn't look confused. He didn't look nervous. He looked amused, as if he had just remembered something, or someone. His eyes slowly moved across the room. Left, then right. The audience followed his gaze. Nobody knew what he was searching for. Then Sinatra smiled, a small smile, barely visible. He raised one hand. The lighting technician looked toward him. Sinatra pointed toward the back. The spotlight moved, slowly. The enormous beam of light traveled across the room. It passed one famous actor, then another, a producer, a journalist, a table filled with Hollywood executives. The room became strangely tense. People began looking around. Who was he looking for? The spotlight continued. Then, it stopped. Marilyn Monroe. For 1 second, Marilyn didn't react. She simply stared toward the stage. The room recognized her before she even moved. A wave of whispers rolled across the tables. Then came the applause. Marilyn blinked. She looked behind herself, as if there might be another Marilyn sitting somewhere. There wasn't. The light was on her. The entire room was looking at her. She slowly smiled. But it wasn't the confident smile people expected. It was nervous, almost embarrassed. She looked toward Sinatra. He was smiling. Marilyn shook her head. No. The audience laughed. Sinatra laughed too. But he didn't turn away. He stepped toward the edge of the stage. The applause grew louder. Marilyn shook her head again. No. Sinatra raised his hand. The orchestra remained silent. The room waited. Marilyn looked around. For years, she had learned how to survive moments like this. Smile, wave, stand, pose, give them what they wanted. But this wasn't a photograph. Sinatra wasn't asking her to smile. He was asking her to come onto the stage. And suddenly, the spotlight felt much hotter. Marilyn slowly stood. The room erupted. She took her first step, then another. Every camera in the room turned toward her. Every eye followed her. She walked toward the stage, but her expression was different now. The closer she came, the less confident she looked. When she reached the stairs, she stopped. Sinatra watched. He didn't rush her. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited. Marilyn looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Sinatra extended his hand. Marilyn stared at it. 1 second. 2. Then she took it. The crowd exploded. She climbed the stairs. And suddenly, she was standing beside Frank Sinatra. 2 legends. 1 stage. 2 completely different kinds of fame. Sinatra had built his reputation with his voice. Marilyn had become an icon through the image Hollywood had created around her. One made people listen. The other made people look. But Sinatra wasn't finished. He leaned toward the microphone. The room quieted. Marilyn stood beside him. Then Sinatra looked at her, not at her dress, not at her hair, not at the famous face that had sold millions of magazine covers. He looked directly into her eyes and said one word. Sing. Marilyn froze. The audience laughed softly. She turned toward him. Her expression seemed to ask, "Are you serious?" Sinatra nodded. The orchestra began again, very softly. A piano, a few strings, nothing more. Sinatra started the song. His voice filled the room. Marilyn stood beside him, listening, watching, waiting. Then the music shifted. Sinatra stopped. He stepped backward, and suddenly Marilyn understood. It was her turn. She looked at him, then at the microphone. Her fingers slowly reached for it. The room became silent again. But this silence was different. The first silence had belonged to Sinatra. This one belonged to Marilyn. She held the microphone. Her fingers trembled slightly. She took a breath, then another. She looked toward the audience, and in that instant, the glamour disappeared. The woman standing beneath the spotlight was no longer the untouchable Marilyn Monroe. She was simply a woman terrified that she might not be good enough. Because there is a difference between being beautiful and being vulnerable. There is a difference between being photographed and being heard. And Marilyn was about to discover which one frightened her more. She lifted the microphone. The first note came out almost as a whisper. It was delicate, soft, not perfect, but real. The room went completely still. Marilyn continued. The second note was stronger, then another. And suddenly something changed. People stopped watching her appearance. They started listening. A man near the front slowly placed his glass on the table. A woman leaned forward. A photographer lowered his camera. Even the orchestra seemed to disappear behind her. Sinatra watched from the side of the stage. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He simply listened. Because he understood something the audience was only beginning to discover. Marilyn didn't need to sound like Sinatra. She didn't need a massive voice. She didn't need to overpower the orchestra. Her strength was somewhere else. It was in the fragility, in the pauses, in the slight tremble, in the feeling behind every word. There was something in her voice that sounded almost painfully personal. Loneliness, hope, fear, longing. Everything Hollywood had hidden beneath her perfect smile seemed to rise to the surface. Marilyn continued, and the more she sang, the less afraid she became. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steadied. She stopped looking at the audience. She stopped looking at Sinatra. She stopped thinking about whether they liked her. For the first time that evening, she forgot they were there. She simply sang. The woman who had spent years being told what she was supposed to be suddenly became free of all of it. No image, no expectations, no Hollywood, just a voice. Sinatra took one step backward, then another. He was giving her the stage. The man who had commanded the entire room moments earlier was now almost invisible. Marilyn stood alone beneath the light, and nobody wanted him to come back. Because something was happening, something nobody had planned. The room was beginning to see her differently, not as the blonde bombshell, not as the woman from the posters, not as the movie star, but as Marilyn. Just Marilyn. She reached the final part of the song. The orchestra became softer, the piano slowed, the strings faded into the background. Marilyn closed her eyes. She took one final breath and sang the last note. Then, nothing. The orchestra stopped. Marilyn opened her eyes. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. Still nothing. Her face changed. The confidence disappeared. She looked toward the audience. Nobody was moving. And suddenly, the old fear returned. I failed. Her hand tightened around the microphone. They were never listening. They were only looking. Her eyes dropped. She looked toward Sinatra. He was standing several feet away, still silent. For one horrible moment, Marilyn seemed completely alone. Then, clap. One sound. One single clap. Sinatra. Marilyn looked up. Clap. Another? Then another. Sinatra stood, and the room exploded. Hundreds of people rose from their seats. Applause crashed across the hall. Cheers erupted. Photographers fired their cameras. People shouted her name. The orchestra members stood. Marilyn stared at them. She looked genuinely shocked, as if she had never expected the room to answer her that way. Sinatra walked toward her. He reached for her hand, then raised it. The applause became deafening. Marilyn looked at him, and for the first time that evening, she didn't look frightened. She looked relieved. The famous smile slowly appeared. But Sinatra noticed something. It wasn't the smile everyone knew. It was smaller, softer, real. And then, while the applause continued around them, Marilyn leaned toward him. Her voice was barely audible. Did they really listen? Sinatra looked at her. He could have made a joke. He could have laughed. He could have given her the kind of charming answer Hollywood expected. But he didn't. He leaned closer and quietly said, "Tonight, they didn't just look at you." He paused. "They heard you." Marilyn stared at him. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she turned toward the audience. Thousands of people were still standing, and something inside her seemed to finally understand. Maybe they had listened. Maybe they had seen something beyond the image. Maybe, just maybe. There was more to Marilyn Monroe than the world had been willing to believe. But what nobody in that room knew was that the applause would eventually disappear. The photographers would leave. The lights would go out. The guests would return home. Hollywood would wake up the next morning and move on to another story. But Marilyn wouldn't forget what happened that night. Because after the applause, after the cameras, after Sinatra walked away from the stage, Marilyn would find herself alone for a few moments backstage. And there, without a single camera watching her, she would finally reveal the one thing she had been too afraid to say in front of the entire room. The truth about why she had almost refused to sing. And when Sinatra heard it, even he wouldn't know what to say. Because sometimes, the most powerful part of a performance isn't the moment when everyone applauds. It's the moment before the applause, when the performer is standing beneath the lights, completely exposed, wondering whether the world will finally see the person behind the legend. There's night. Marilyn Monroe. The applause was still echoing through the hall when Marilyn Monroe stepped away from the microphone. For everyone else, the moment was a triumph. For Marilyn, it was something far more complicated. She had just stood in front of one of Hollywood's most powerful audiences and done the one thing she had been afraid to do. She had sung, and they had listened. But beneath the smile, her hands were still trembling. The cameras were everywhere now. Flash, flash, flash. Reporters pushed forward. People called her name. Someone shouted a question from the crowd. "Marilyn, how does it feel?" She turned toward them. The famous smile appeared instantly. Beautiful. Perfect. Effortless. Wonderful. The reporters laughed. Another question. "Were you nervous?" Marilyn laughed again. "No." The answer came too quickly. Sinatra, standing beside her, looked at her. He knew. She had been terrified. But he said nothing. Because there are some truths you don't expose in front of an audience, especially when the person standing beside you has spent her entire life hiding them. The reporters continued asking questions. Marilyn answered them with jokes. She smiled. She posed. She tilted her head toward the cameras. She became Marilyn Monroe again. The woman Hollywood knew. The woman everyone could photograph. The woman everyone thought they understood. But Sinatra watched carefully. He saw what happened whenever the cameras turned away. Her smile disappeared. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes became distant. For a brief moment, she wasn't the star anymore. She was simply tired. Finally, one reporter asked the question that changed the atmosphere. "Marilyn, did Frank Sinatra convince you to sing?" She looked toward Sinatra. A small smile appeared. "He told me to." The room laughed. Sinatra shook his head, but Marilyn continued. "He wouldn't take no for an answer." More laughter. The reporters loved it. It was the perfect Hollywood story. Frank Sinatra discovers Marilyn Monroe's hidden talent. Marilyn gets on stage. The audience goes wild. Everyone laughs. Everyone smiles. Everyone goes home happy. Except that wasn't the story. Not really. Because the truth was sitting quietly behind Marilyn's eyes. She hadn't been afraid of the song. She had been afraid of what would happen if people actually heard her. Eventually, the reporters moved away. The crowd began returning to their conversations. The orchestra started playing softly in the background. Marilyn stepped away from the stage. She walked toward a quiet hallway backstage. The noise followed her for several seconds. Then it disappeared. The moment she turned the corner, the smile vanished. She stopped, closed her eyes, and exhaled. A long, shaky breath. She placed one hand against the wall. For the first time all evening, nobody was watching. No cameras, no journalists, no audience, no spotlight, just silence. Then she heard footsteps. She opened her eyes. Sinatra was standing at the end of the hallway. "You disappeared." Marilyn smiled faintly. "I needed air." "You're inside," she laughed. "Then I needed quieter air." Sinatra smiled. He walked closer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he looked at her hands. They were still trembling. "You were nervous." Marilyn looked down. "A little." "A little?" She laughed softly. "Fine." She took a breath. "I thought I was going to faint." Sinatra smiled. "But you didn't." "No." "You sang." She looked at him. "Barely." "You sang enough." Marilyn leaned against the wall. The noise from the main hall could still be heard faintly behind them. Music, laughter, glasses, Hollywood. She looked toward the sound, then quietly said, "They weren't supposed to hear me." Sinatra frowned. "Why not?" Marilyn looked at him. "Because that's not what they came for." "What did they come for?" She smiled bitterly. You know what they came for. Sinatra didn't answer. She continued. They came to see Marilyn Monroe. She paused. They didn't come to hear her. Sinatra looked at her. And what's the difference? Marilyn's smile disappeared. Everything. Silence. She looked down at the floor. They know what I look like. Her voice became quieter. They know what dress I'm wearing. They know what my hair looks like. They know how I smile. They know how to photograph me. She looked up. But they don't know me. Sinatra remained silent. Marilyn continued. Sometimes I think if I walked into a room without makeup, without the dress, without the name, she paused. Nobody would recognize me. Sinatra looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Maybe that's because they never really learned how to look. Marilyn stared at him. The words seemed to hit somewhere deeper than he expected. She looked away. You know what's strange? What? Everyone says I have everything. Sinatra waited. Fame. Money. Beauty. Movies. She laughed softly. They say I'm lucky. Then her voice changed. But sometimes I feel like the loneliest person in the room. Sinatra didn't interrupt. He knew better. Some people don't need advice. They need someone willing to stay. Marilyn looked toward the empty hallway. Do you ever feel that way? Sinatra's expression changed. He didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded. Sometimes. She looked at him. Even you? Especially me. Marilyn smiled faintly. Everyone thinks you're fearless. They're wrong. Everyone thinks you know exactly who you are. Sinatra gave a quiet laugh. That's the biggest lie of all. Marilyn looked at him differently now. For the first time that night, she wasn't looking at Frank Sinatra, the legend. She was looking at the man. And perhaps he was doing the same. Two people surrounded by fame. Two people who could walk into any room and receive applause. Two people who could still feel completely alone after everyone had gone home. Marilyn slowly sat down on a nearby chair. Sinatra remained standing. She looked at him. Why did you do it? Do what? Bring me up there. He knew exactly what she meant. He didn't answer. Frank. He looked at her. Why? He finally said, Because you needed to know. Know what? That you could. She shook her head. That doesn't make sense. It will. He stepped closer. You spend too much time worrying about what people expect from you. Marilyn looked away. You don't understand. I do. No. She looked back at him. You're a singer. So? You walk onto a stage and people expect you to sing. He nodded. I walk onto a stage, and people expect me to be Marilyn Monroe. She paused. And sometimes, I don't even know what that means anymore. Sinatra stared at her. That sentence stayed between them. Then he said, Then stop being her for a minute. Marilyn looked confused. What? Just be yourself. She smiled sadly. I don't know how. Sinatra's voice softened. Then start by finding out. Marilyn looked at him. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she asked, Was my voice terrible? Sinatra smiled. No. Be honest. I am. Was it good? He thought for a second. It was honest. Marilyn raised an eyebrow. That isn't the same thing. It is tonight. She smiled. He continued. Perfect voices are everywhere. He paused. Honest ones are rare. Marilyn looked down. Something about that answer affected her. She had spent years trying to become perfect. Perfect smile, perfect body, perfect photographs, perfect performances. But perhaps perfection was never what people remembered. Maybe they remembered what made them feel something. And tonight, she had made an entire room feel something. Suddenly, a sound came from the main hall. Applause. Another performer had begun. Marilyn looked toward the doorway, then back at Sinatra. Everyone's already moved on. Sinatra nodded. That's Hollywood? She laughed. You sound disappointed. I'm not. Why? Because tomorrow they'll find something else to talk about. Marilyn smiled. And tonight? Tonight belongs to you. She looked at him. Only tonight? He smiled. If you're lucky. She laughed. For the first time since leaving the stage, the tension disappeared from her face. Then Sinatra said something that made her stop laughing. Don't let them turn you into a picture. Marilyn stared at him. What? A picture can't tell people who you are. He paused. Your voice can. She looked toward the stage. The words echoed in her mind. Don't let them turn you into a picture. For years, Hollywood had done exactly that. It had taken Marilyn Monroe and transformed her into an image. Something larger than a person. Something everyone could desire. Everyone could admire. Everyone could photograph. But an image doesn't have to be understood. A person does. Marilyn slowly stood. She looked toward Sinatra. I think I'm beginning to understand. Good. What happens now? Now? She nodded. After tonight. Sinatra shrugged. Tomorrow, you wake up. She laughed. That's your advice. Yes. That's terrible advice. It's honest advice. She smiled, then looked down the hallway. The party was still going. Hollywood was still shining. The world was still watching. But something inside her had changed. She had walked onto that stage afraid that people would hear her and discover she wasn't perfect. Instead, they heard something more valuable. They heard her humanity. And perhaps that was what Sinatra had wanted all along. Not to prove Marilyn could sing, but to prove she didn't have to be perfect to deserve the spotlight. A few minutes later, Marilyn walked back toward the main hall. She stopped before entering. The noise was overwhelming. Music, laughter, voices, cameras. She looked at Sinatra. Are you coming? He nodded. They walked back together. As they entered the room, people turned. Some smiled. Some applauded. Some called Marilyn's name. She smiled back. But this time, she didn't look nervous. She didn't look like someone trying to survive the attention. She looked like someone who had finally learned how to stand inside it. Sinatra noticed. He smiled. Then he whispered, "Better." Marilyn laughed. "You're still watching me?" "Someone has to." She looked at him. "Thank you." He shrugged. "For what?" "For tonight." He shook his head. "I didn't sing." She smiled. "No." She looked toward the stage. "I did." Sinatra smiled. And that was the moment something changed between them. Not romance, not fame, not publicity. Something simpler. Respect. Two people who understood what it meant to live behind an image. Two people who understood how heavy applause could become when the room went quiet. Eventually, the night began to end. Guests started leaving. Cars waited outside. Reporters packed their equipment. The chandeliers remained bright, but the room slowly emptied. Marilyn stood near the stage. She looked at the microphone one last time. Earlier, she had been terrified of it. Now, she almost wanted to touch it again. She stepped onto the stage. The room was nearly empty. No applause, no cameras, no reporters. She walked toward the microphone, placed one hand on it, and smiled. Sinatra watched from the shadows. Marilyn turned. "You're still here? I forgot something." "What?" He smiled. "You." She laughed. "You're impossible." "That's what they say." She looked around the empty room, then quietly asked, "Frank?" "Yes." Do you think they really saw me tonight? Sinatra didn't answer immediately. He looked at the empty seats, then at her, and finally said, "No." Marilyn's smile disappeared. He continued, "Not all of them." She looked confused. "Then why did you bring me up there?" Sinatra stepped into the light. "Because one day," he paused, "they might." Marilyn stared at him, and for the first time that night, she understood. The goal had never been to make everyone understand her. The goal was to stop hiding from herself. She smiled, a real smile. Then she walked toward the exit. But before she disappeared into the hallway, she stopped, turned around, and looked at the stage, the empty microphone, the empty chairs, the fading lights. She whispered something nobody heard, something only she needed to hear. Then she walked away. The final spotlight slowly dimmed. The room became dark. But the story wasn't over. Because outside, Hollywood was already preparing for tomorrow. New headlines, new photographs, new rumors, new stories. And somewhere inside that building, Marilyn Monroe had just discovered something that could change the way she saw herself forever. But there was one thing she still didn't know. One final conversation with Sinatra was waiting. And in that conversation, Marilyn would ask him the question she had been too afraid to ask anyone else. If the world stopped looking at me tomorrow, would there still be anything left? And Sinatra's answer would be the one thing she never. The room was almost empty. Only a few lights remained above the stage. The chandeliers that had once illuminated hundreds of faces now seemed strangely distant. The laughter was gone. The champagne glasses were being collected. The orchestra had packed away its instruments. Hollywood was leaving. But Marilyn Monroe was still there, standing alone near the stage. The same stage where, only hours earlier, hundreds of people had watched her take a microphone with trembling hands. She looked at the empty seats. For a moment, she could almost hear the applause again. Then she remembered the silence, that terrible silence after her final note. The 3 seconds when she thought she had failed. 3 seconds that felt longer than her entire career. Marilyn slowly walked toward the microphone. She touched it. Her fingers no longer trembled. She smiled. Earlier, she had been afraid of that microphone. Now, she wasn't. Behind her, footsteps echoed through the empty hall. She turned. Frank Sinatra was standing in the doorway. "You're still here." Marilyn smiled. "So are you." Sinatra walked toward her. "I forgot something." "What?" He looked at her. "You." She laughed. "You really don't know how to leave a dramatic moment alone, do you?" "No." He smiled. They stood there beneath the fading lights. Two of Hollywood's most famous people, in a room that suddenly felt like nobody knew them at all. Marilyn looked toward the empty seats. Everyone's gone. Eventually, everyone goes. She looked at him. "That sounds depressing." "It's realistic," she smiled, then became quiet. "Frank?" "Yes?" "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." She looked down at the microphone. "Why did you really bring me up there?" Sinatra didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the front of the stage, then turned back. "Because you were sitting there." "That isn't an answer." He smiled. "I know." Marilyn waited. Sinatra finally said, "Because I saw you." She looked confused. "Everyone saw me." "No." He shook his head. "They saw Marilyn Monroe." He paused. "I saw you." The words hit her harder than she expected. Marilyn looked away. For years, people had told her they loved her. Millions knew her name. Millions knew her face. But somehow, very few people had ever told her they actually saw her. She sat down on the edge of the stage. Sinatra remained standing beside her. Marilyn stared at the empty room. "Do you know what it's like? To be famous?" She shook her head. "To be looked at all the time," she paused, "and still feel invisible." Sinatra said nothing. She continued. "People look at me and they already know who I am." She laughed quietly. "They don't even have to meet me." She looked at him. "They think they know everything." Sinatra nodded. "That's the price." "What price?" "Being famous." Marilyn smiled sadly. "I don't think it's a price." "What is it?" "A prison." The word remained in the air. Prison. Marilyn looked toward the empty audience. "Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I walked down the street tomorrow without anyone knowing who I was." Sinatra asked, "Would you like that?" She thought about it. "Yes." Then shook her head. "No." He smiled. "You don't know?" "No." She looked at him. "Because I've never had it." Silence. Then Marilyn asked the question she had been carrying all night. "If the world stopped looking at me tomorrow," she paused, "would there still be anything left?" Sinatra looked at her. This time, he didn't answer quickly. He knew this wasn't a question that needed a clever response. Marilyn wasn't asking about movies. She wasn't asking about fame. She wasn't asking about money. She was asking whether the woman beneath the image was enough. Finally, Sinatra sat beside her. He looked straight ahead, then said, "Yes." Marilyn looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because tonight I heard her." Marilyn's eyes became wet. She quickly looked away. Sinatra continued. "You think your voice was important tonight?" She nodded. "It wasn't." She looked confused. "The important thing wasn't that you sang." He turned toward her. "The important thing was that you were afraid, and you did it anyway." Marilyn stared at him. He continued. "That is who you are." She swallowed. "Not the dress. Not the photographs. Not the name. Not the headlines." He paused. "You." Marilyn looked down. A tear slowly moved across her cheek. She wiped it away before he could say anything. Then she laughed softly. "I hate crying." Sinatra smiled. "Most people do." "I look terrible." "No." She looked at him. "You're still lying." "I'm a singer." She laughed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "We lie for a living." She laughed again. This time, the sound echoed through the empty hall. And for a moment, she wasn't Marilyn Monroe. She was just a woman laughing with someone who understood her. Then Sinatra stood. "Come on." "Where?" "Home." Marilyn looked at the stage one last time. She stood. They walked toward the exit. But before leaving, Marilyn stopped. She turned back. The microphone was still standing beneath the spotlight. She stared at it, then slowly walked back. Sinatra watched. Marilyn reached for the microphone. She didn't sing. She simply held it, then whispered, "Thank you." Sinatra smiled. "For what?" "For making me do that." He shook his head. "I didn't make you do anything." She looked at him. "You're right." She smiled. "I decided." Sinatra nodded. "Exactly." She put the microphone down, then walked away. The two disappeared into the hallway. Behind them, the final lights began shutting off. One by one. The stage became darker. The room became quieter, until only one spotlight remained. Then even that disappeared. And Hollywood moved on. The next morning, newspapers would have their stories. Photographers would have their pictures. People would talk about Sinatra. People would talk about Marilyn. Some would remember the applause. Some would remember her standing beneath the spotlight. Some would remember the unexpected duet. But the most important part would never appear in a newspaper. Nobody would know how frightened Marilyn had been before she sang. Nobody would know what she had confessed backstage. Nobody would know about the question she had asked Sinatra when the room was empty. Nobody would know that beneath the famous smile was a woman who had spent years wondering whether she was enough. And perhaps that was the tragedy of fame. The world could know everything about your image, and almost nothing about you. But that night, something changed. Not Hollywood, not the press, not the audience. Marilyn. She had walked onto the stage believing she needed to prove something. She walked away realizing she didn't. She didn't need to have the strongest voice. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to satisfy everyone. She didn't need to become the woman Hollywood wanted. She only needed to be brave enough to become herself. And that was the real gift Sinatra had given her. Not a performance, not a spotlight, not applause, permission. Permission to step outside the image. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to be afraid. Permission to be heard. Because the world had spent years teaching Marilyn how to smile. That night, someone finally encouraged her to speak. And perhaps that is why the imagined night remains so powerful. Because beneath the glamorous clothes, the crystal chandeliers, the cameras, and the applause, there were two people standing beneath a spotlight. One was Frank Sinatra, a man whose voice could fill an entire room. The other was Marilyn Monroe, a woman whose face had become known around the world. But for a few minutes, the roles reversed. Sinatra became the listener. Marilyn became the voice. And Hollywood finally stopped looking and listened. But the most beautiful part came after everyone had gone. When there was no audience left, no cameras, no applause, no reason to perform. Marilyn was still smiling, not the famous smile, not the Hollywood smile, her own. And perhaps that was the moment she truly understood something. A person does not become valuable because the world applauds. The world applauds because sometimes someone finally dares to show it something real. Marilyn had done that. She had stood beneath the brightest light in Hollywood while feeling completely exposed. And she had sung anyway. That was courage, not perfection, not confidence. Courage. The courage to stand there when your hands are shaking. The courage to continue when you think everyone is judging you. The courage to let people hear the voice you've spent years hiding. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside the story. Sometimes the world doesn't need another perfect image. It needs a real person. Someone willing to step out from behind the mask. Someone willing to say, "This is me. This is my voice. This is what I've been afraid to show you." And maybe that's why the final image of that night should never be Marilyn surrounded by applause. It should be Marilyn standing alone on an empty stage after everyone has left. The spotlight fading, the room silent, the microphone beside her. No cameras, no reporters, no audience, just her. And for the first time, she isn't afraid, because she finally understands. Even if tomorrow the cameras disappear, even if Hollywood looks somewhere else, even if the world stops staring, she will still be there. Marilyn. Not the picture, not the fantasy, not the legend, the woman. And somewhere in the darkness behind her, Frank Sinatra's voice seems to remain like an echo. You were never just what they saw. Marilyn looks back one final time, then smiles and walks away. The lights go out. The stage disappears into darkness. Hollywood keeps moving. But for one night, the most photographed woman in the world wasn't asking to be seen. She was asking to be heard. And when she finally sang, the entire room listened. Not because she was Marilyn Monroe, but because, for those few minutes, she was simply herself. And sometimes, That is the most powerful thing a person